Okay, so to understand the difference principle and why Rawls thinks we would choose it from the original position, we have to go back and think about the original position and the veil of ignorance again. So remember, Rawls says, he thinks the fair principles for society are the principles we would choose from the original position. Well, we've already seen we would choose basic rights, but then what kind of principles would we choose when it comes to how much income people can have, how much the rich owe the poor, what sorts of a social safety net do we have? We haven't talked about those issues yet. Well, I think the good way to get into what Rawls' answer to these questions is to first start talking about some principles we wouldn't choose from the original position to answer these questions. And here's one. Well, imagine we say, well, what about this principle? We have the first principle of justice, basic rights, but as far as programs to help those who are not so well off, we're going to do nothing. If you end up poor and starving on the street, tough luck, we'll let you starve. Now, why, if you were just looking out for yourself, wouldn't you choose a principle like that? You say, from the original position, we just let the market turn out as it will. If you're lucky, you're lucky. You can be as well off as you want. You can do whatever you want with your money. If you're poor, stinks to be you, but we'll let you starve in the street. That's just your bad luck. Why wouldn't you choose a principle like that from the original position? Well, think again. You don't know who you are. You might be poor. And it's not just that you might be poor. You might be somebody who's poor and doesn't really have any talents that will let you sort of work your way up in a society like this. So you might be poor, you might not be particularly talented, you might not be able to do anything that's in great demand. And if that were you, if you come out of the original position and find that this is who you are, you would want some kinds of provisions to be made for you. You wouldn't want to be just left to starve on the street. So you're, from the original position, you know this is a possibility. You want to make some allowances, some provisions for the poor. Why? Because you might be poor. Not just that you might be poor and not really have much in the way of resources you could use to bring yourself out of being poor. Okay, so we'd want some allowances for the poor, but what exactly? One thing Rawls rejects is pure equality. Everybody earns the same amount of money. Rawls is not a communist. He does not believe that everybody ought to earn the same amount. Well, why would Rawls reject communism? Well, for two reasons. One, historical communism was terrible. It was brutal. There were all kinds of violations of people's basic rights. No way historical communism could respect the first principle of justice. You don't have due process. You don't have free speech. You don't have freedom of religion when you're dragging people off in the middle of the night for criticizing Comrade Stalin or whoever, right? So, and Rawls would say, your system must respect the first principle of justice. And not just that. Rawls thinks that we can't violate the first principle of justice even in the name of equality. And this will be important. Rawls will say, well, it might be the case that, some people just won't do as well because of their families. Well, we have to respect the family. We can't interfere grossly in family life just in the name of equality. Some people might not do as well because of their religion. Maybe their religion is just doesn't value material success all that much. And Rawls would say again, we have to respect religion. If they're just not interested in material success, you can't come in and muck with their religion in the name of equality. First principle trumps the second. Historical communism, Rawls would say one of the huge problems with it is that it made equality the only important thing. Rawls thinks equality or fairness is important, but even Rawls will say the first principle of justice is more important than equality. Okay, but what about a system that had strict equality without the horrible, horrible violations of basic rights that we see in actual communist systems like, Stalin's Russia or Mao's China. Well, Rawls would still not think that strict equality is a good idea. Why not? Why would you not want to choose strict equality from the original position? Why would you want to allow some inequality? Think about that for a second. Why, from the original position, would you think it's a good idea to allow some inequality no matter who you might turn out to be? All right, well, think of it this way, right? Imagine that we pay everybody the same amount of money. We pay janitors $25,000 a year, we pay doctors $25,000, we pay lawyers, we pay people who work in fast food, we pay people who are engineers $25,000. Well, ask yourself a question. If we did that, and we can even up the money, $30,000, $40,000, whatever, do you think we're going to have enough doctors? And do you think the doctors we do have will be good enough? And think about that for any profession, right? Think about how hard it is to be a doctor. All these tests, all this study, all those years of school, then residency. Some people would still do it, yes, even if they didn't get paid more, but we wouldn't have enough, right? And this goes for a lot of professions. Who would work like crazy to found their own business if they were going to be capped at $40,000 a year, right? Some people would still do it. They just want to invent stuff, but not enough. Things wouldn't go very well. And Rawls would say, no matter who you are, strict equality would be bad for you. If you're the poorest of the poor and society doesn't have enough skilled doctors or people aren't inventing stuff, that's going to be bad for you. So Rawls says, even without the human rights abuses, even without the horrible things you see in communism, people wouldn't pick strict equality from the original position. Why? Because no matter who you might turn out to be, strict equality is bad. It doesn't give talented people who could make a contribution enough of an incentive to make a contribution. All right, but then Rawls would also say, well, how much in the way of inequality do you really need to get people to make a contribution? People aren't going to become doctors. People aren't going to found the next Apple, maybe, if you cap incomes at $40,000 a year. Do you have to let them earn $100 million a year? $200 million? Billions a year? Rawls will say we need some inequality to encourage people to work hard and develop their talents, but just how much do we actually need? Okay, so Rawls' second principle of justice has two parts. So inequalities have to satisfy two conditions. They have to benefit the least well-off person, and they have to allow for real equality of opportunity. Well, what does this mean? Well, I'll talk a bit more about it first. Let's take a first pass at it. What this means must be to the benefit of the least well-off person. Well, Rawls will say, if you want to know if an inequality is justified, if you want to know if our society is just, in fact, all you need to do is to look at the least well-off person, the person on the bottom, the poorest of the poor. Now, Rawls doesn't think that there's one guy who's the poorest of the poor we need to look at. There's no guy Steve or whatever. Rawls thinks of the least well-off representative person. You look at the group of people, the social class on the bottom, you ask how well they're doing. If they could be doing better, if we could make their lives better, we could make their income higher, Rawls would say we do it. We don't look at anybody else. We don't look at the people in the middle. We don't look at the people at the top. We don't even look at people who are poor, but not the poorest of the poor. We look at the poorest people in society. And if things could be going better for them, if we could make their life better, then our society's not just. You want to know if your society's just? Are the poorest of the poor doing as well as they can. Any inequality that does not benefit the poorest of the poor shouldn't be allowed. Second part of this second principle of justice must allow for real equality of opportunity. And what this means is that with a few qualifications, everybody ought to have the same chances in life. Now, I'm actually going to talk about A here a bit more at the end. I want to talk about B first, well, for a few reasons. A is so radical, we might not accept it. And B kind of gets lost in the shuffle, but I do want to talk about B because I think it's interesting, and I think even B requires a lot of us. And I also think we might be more convinced by B that inequalities must allow for real equality of opportunity at the end of the day than we are by A that they must benefit the least well-off person. Okay. So before we talk about the first part, inequalities must benefit the least well-off, let's talk about real equality of opportunity. Real equality of opportunity doesn't mean, strictly speaking, everybody ought to have the same chances to be successful in any career. That would be crazy, right? We don't want a guy like me whose hands aren't that steady being a surgeon. It would be crazy if Rawls said, oh, Sam Duncan, whose hands aren't that steady, ought to have the same chances of being a surgeon as a guy whose hands never shake the least little bit. That would be stupid. Same thing, it would be dumb if Rawls were to say, well, somebody who can't really do math that well, he ought to have the same chances of being an engineer as a guy who's great at math. That would be dumb, right? What Rawls does say, though, is talent and willingness to work hard. Relevant talents for the career and how hard you're willing to work, that ought to be the only things that determine your chances of success. Now think, why would we choose this part of the second principle in the original position? Well, because we might come out of the original position and find that we are talented and hardworking, but poor. If that were the case, we would want to have the same chances as someone who just happens to be luckier and is richer than us. Or we might come out and find, well, we're not particularly talented, but our kids are. We'd want their chances of success not to be shaped by our bad luck, but by their own talents and willingness to work hard. So you can see why we would choose this principle. And I think this is a pretty intuitive principle, whatever you might think of Rawls. And one thing I want you to think of is to ask yourself, does our society have real equality of opportunity? And if we don't, what stands in the way of it? And what would we have to do to achieve real equality of opportunity? I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this question because I do want to get to the rest of what I want to say about Rawls, but there is a lot to say on this. I don't think there's any way we can say we have real equality of opportunity, that people's chances of success are determined only by how hard they work or their talents. I'll give you guys one small example. How good the schools are is determined a lot by how well you pay the teachers. And how well you pay the teachers is determined by how much money you have. And how much money you have for the school system, well, that's determined by property taxes. So if your property is worth more and you and the people around you pay more in taxes, then your children can go to better schools. Heck, if you're well enough off, it doesn't even matter if the schools are good. You can just pay for private schools, right? So I think it's really hard to argue that we have real equality of opportunity. And if we don't, and that's not the only reason, I'm betting that any of you could reel off 10 reasons if you thought about it for 10 minutes. If we don't have real equality of opportunity, well, shouldn't we be troubled by it? Because this is part of Rawls that I think is very convincing, even if we might not buy the rest. Shouldn't this lack of real equality of opportunity be something that concerns us? I don't know how we fix it. I'm a philosopher, not a social scientist, but we should at least notice it. We should think about it. As interesting as this real equality of opportunity condition is, I want to leave it behind. It's a lot to say, but, can't say as much as you want to about everything. So what I want to finish with is this so-called difference principle. This idea that who you look at to see if your society is just, if it's fair, is the poorest person of all. Now think about how much this would be different than our actual politics. Yeah, a lot of us do kind of care about the poor, but we also care about the middle class. If we embraced Rawls' difference principle, our first question would always be, are the poorest people in society doing as well as they could? You don't, if I give you, and I might do this on a quiz, so pay attention, if I gave you a little schematic of society and I said rich, middle, poor, well, which is the fair, which is the best distribution of income? Well, if I did that, you shouldn't even look at rich and middle. You should just look at poor, the people on the very bottom. In fact, to be more accurate, you shouldn't even look at poor. You should look at poorest of the poor. Well, why this emphasis on the poorest of the poor? I think you could say, yeah, of course, Rawls, we wouldn't want to let the poorest of the poor starve because we might come out of the original position and be the poorest of the poor. Why do you, Rawls, think we'd put so much focus on them? Why do you think we would only choose a principle that says that the poorest of the poor have to be as well off as possible? Well, I think it might help to think of what Rawls is saying in terms of insurance. Think about insurance, right? Coming out of the original position and the worst happening, you being the poorest of the poor, well, you would want enough insurance if that happened, you would still be okay. It's not likely to happen, but if it does, you want to be okay. In the same way, think about all the forms of insurance we have. We have life insurance, we have car insurance, health insurance. Take car insurance, right? If we have enough money, most of us probably put enough coverage on our car that if some idiot hits us and it's totaled, we can replace it. It might not be fun to replace it, we might have to go through a lot of grief, but we would put enough, if we have the resources, we would put enough insurance on our car that we're not going to be left without a car. So Rawls would say, well, in that same way, from the original position, you might end up the poorest of the poor, so you would want insurance if that happened. Let me give you guys what I think. This isn't quite Rawls' argument, but I think it's a decent reconstruction of it. So let's look at it. Rawls' argument. It's rational to insure yourself against the worst happening. We might come out of the original position and find ourselves the poorest of the poor. That's the worst happening. So from the original position, it would be rational to choose principles that, quote, insure us against being the poorest of the poor. The difference principle is the most generous insurance should the worst happen. So from the original position, the difference principle, this principle, the least well have to be doing as well as possible, is the only principle we would choose. Well, think about that for a second. Is this a good argument or not? Can we go from this claim we would want some kind of insurance against the worst happening to the claim we would choose the most generous insurance? Think about why you don't probably have the most generous insurance on your car in case of it getting totaled. You probably have a deductible. Why? Even if you could pay more money, you have a deductible, I'm betting. Why is that? Think about it for a second and we'll come back to this in the next slide. Well, as I said in the last slide, we probably don't have as much insurance on our car as we could. We probably don't have as much health insurance as we could. And we probably think, somebody who paid hundreds and hundreds of dollars every month to have practically no deductible, we would think he was crazy. Why? Even if he could afford it, there are better things to spend the money on. You shouldn't be so afraid. Most of us would think of the worst happening. Yes, you should cover yourself if the worst happens, but are you going to focus all your attention on the worst happening or not? Well, how is this relevant to the original position and whether or not we would choose the difference principle? Well, look, it might be that we come out and be the poorest of the poor, but we might also be middle class. We might be rich. We might be poor, but not the poorest of the poor. And if our principle of justice, if our principle about who should get what says we'll focus on the poorest of the poor, there's a good chance that the middle class and other people, the rich and even, maybe the poor who aren't the poorest of the poor, will have to sacrifice to help the poorest of the poor. So my point here is we would want some kind of allowances for the poorest of the poor because we might be them. But would we really put all of our effort on it? Would we really want to make sure things, to insure ourselves against the worst happening if we come to the original position at any cost? I'm not so sure we would. So I think Rawls is right. We want some kind of allowances. We want some kind of social support for the poorest of the poor. We don't want things to go too badly for them. Why? Well, if we were choosing principles from the original position, we would want some kind of quote-unquote insurance in case we were the poorest of the poor. But does Rawls establish that we would choose something as strong as the difference principle? This principle, only look at the poorest of the poor and how society's going. I'm not so sure that he does. And I think to assume that he does, Rawls has to imagine that we're all really terrified of risk. So I don't think Rawls actually shows that we should be so concerned about the poorest of the poor that we choose such a strong principle. A weaker principle, some kind of social minimum that provides for the poorest of the poor, keeps them above a certain limit, that might be the principle we would choose from the original position. And so then a way you might think of the original position, Rawls thinks it's a math problem with only one solution. When you get into some levels of math, your problem might have several different perfectly viable, perfectly right solutions. So I think Rawls is right that we would only choose the first principle of justice from the original position. But when it comes to the second principle, I don't know. There might be a number of different principles we might choose, and it might be that, those all are perfectly legitimate, perfectly fine principles of justice. There might be some principles of justice, principles of who gets what kinds of income distribution we allow that fail, right? Like, let the poorest of the poor starve. That would fail because we might be the poorest of the poor. But there might be plenty of others that pass, and there still might be some argument to be done seeing which ones we should choose or not. Or let me put it this way. I'll go back to my insurance metaphor. We all agree that someone who has no insurance whatsoever on his car, on his house, on his health, he's crazy, right? Bad things can happen. But how much does he really need? Reasonable people can disagree on that. It's crazy. It's really unfair because we'd want some allowances, some provisions made for the poor from the original position. So it'd be crazy to have nothing for the poor. But how much should we do? How much is enough? Well, Rawls, for all he's established, it might be that reasonable people can disagree on that. Still, I think Rawls proves a lot, that we should have some social minimum for the poor. That's a pretty interesting conclusion. A lot of people won't agree with that. And even if Rawls doesn't get this strong principle focused so much on the poorest of the poor, the idea that the poorest of the poor ought to have at least a decent minimum of living, which I think Rawls's argument probably does establish, that's interesting. And I think this real equality of opportunity principle, which I talked about a bit, I think Rawls' argument probably establishes that, and also that's interesting. Well, so I'll stop with Rawls there. Next time we'll start with Nozick, and Nozick wants to basically turn over the whole Rawlsian thing. Nozick says that this whole concern for equality, this whole concern for fairness that Rawls has, is just mistaken. That's not what we ought to be worried about with political philosophy. We shouldn't even be in the business of talking about a fair distribution of income. That just doesn't make sense. We're down the wrong path if we do that. Well, how does Nozick argue that? Well, that's what we'll see next time.